one of my aims in life is to see Robert Hart's statue restored on the Bund, because the Japanese took it down, using it for making guns, no doubt. And I decided, no, what we really need to do is develop our links with China and go there and build connections and build networks. So I didn't go to the United States other than to visit family, which my wife is American, so I get to do that. But I went as much as possible to the United States, and I went as much as possible to China.
You mean like conferences?
Conferences. Most of my sabbaticals were in China and Taiwan, Taiwan, Nanjing, because of the sources for the Republican period. And I think that I'm actually, looking back at it now, I think that was a good thing to do. I learned an enormous amount from my Chinese colleagues, including about military history, which of course the re-evaluation of the Republican period had begun by the late 90s, mid 80s. It had begun, and I sort of was part of that wave that began to reassess the Republican period, and that shaped, my second and third book profoundly, and it allowed me access to sources there that were probably not open to most people. So.
And was this a conscious decision?
Very, yeah.
But that also means kind of turning away from the U.S.
Yes, it did. Absolutely. Yeah.
So there was a growing divide.
Well, I could think what influenced me, but I know what influenced me was that my dissertation advisor, Philip Kuhn, was very strong on this. And he was, of course, one of the first in the United States to spend a whole sabbatical in Beijing. And I visited him at that point, I think, or maybe later. But so for him, if you do Chinese history, the point is not so much to have influence among China studies circles in America. Your research is only good if Chinese historians also find it interesting and worthwhile reading it, which means doing real archival research that other people haven't looked at. That's a hallmark of his scholarship. And I thought that is absolutely right. So I wanted to do stuff that hopefully would actually be of interest to Chinese historians just as much as, hopefully also in the United States or in Europe and so on. But the name of the game was to build a name, or to at least hope that your research has some value to Chinese colleagues. I thought, that's right. And so in a way, it's an American influence that made me go to China, but I think that is right. And I think, I've never regretted that.
Okay.
And as you know, part of the fun, of course, is when we go to China, we're always treated far better than we should be.
Far better than we treat our visitors.
Absolutely, embarrassingly.
Or the university.
Yeah, embarrassingly so. But so it was not punishment, but.
Okay, and so you also lived in Taiwan?
I lived in Taiwan. I'd spent a year there during my PhD, and then I spent at least one more time a whole year there with my family. And we're all there, and then I spent there, several periods of a couple of months, weekends, weeks for conferences and so on. So I spent a lot of time there. Then again, that's the Academia Sinica is a wonderful place. The library at Academia Sinica for Republican history is the best in the world. It's absolutely great, a good archive. I spent a lot of time there. I spent most of my time really in China, in Nanjing. Again, we spent a year there, maybe.
In Nanjing?
In Nanjing.
In Nanjing.
Yeah, it was 6 months, I think. Yeah, for doing one sabbatical, living in the home of a Chinese friend of mine. In the 90s. It's still fairly basic. Let's put it that way.
And Nanjing because of archives?
Archives.
Yeah. Were they accessible in the 90s?
Well, many people went to Shanghai, right? To the Shanghai Library and so on. And so I didn't. Everybody's going there, so why go there?
The Americans went to Shanghai.
So Shanghai Studies became a big thing, and I thought, no, if I really want to research the violence, the horrid violence of 20th century China, you got to do this probably not in Shanghai, but in Nanjing, where the Republican archives are. And I found, you build connections, you build friendships, and I found it always straightforward to work there.
But could you access
a
lot of
material? Not everything, but a lot. And then again, sort of my good fortune of running into good archives in Nanjing. At one day I was having a smoke outside the gates, that had to be outside the gates by that time, with the Fu Guanzhang, the deputy head, later became the head. And he said, you see this front building, that's all the Nanjing government archive. Now, there's another building behind it, 4 or 5 stories high. All that stuff is in English, and we don't know what to do with it because we can't read the language. And so he said, well, what is it? This is from the Haiguan, the customs service. So, could you please help? Well, yeah. That was kind of a unique opportunity because there's a whole huge archive which actually spans 1850, 1950 from the customs service. It was how many? 52,000 files, each subdivided into many, 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 many files. So it was a huge archive that nobody had looked at. So it had been dispersed in the Second World War, and then they had just brought it together because they were collecting stuff from all over the place. And they needed help putting it together. So I set up a project with Robert Bickers, who was a good English empire historian as well as a Chinese historian. And that took, we had to make a whole catalogue, etc., etc., etc. But that's unique material and a whole different. So until then, what we could use to write late 19th, 20th century history was the Republican archives of the nationalists, really, and that was about it. And whatever the Chinese Communist Party deigned to publish. And then we have all the foreign archives, which are also actually, I think, it's beginning to change, but not used enough, because there's a lot of good stuff in foreign archives. There's the Russian archives that few people are actually.
Okay.
There would be a lot of really interesting stuff, but they're closing down again too. And then there's the customs archive, and it's not just in Nanjing, it's in every treaty port that existed, 20, 30 of them. There are local archives related to the customs, and some are open, some are not. And so just opening up this whole thing, it was great opportunity. Worked closely with colleagues at the Second Historical Archives, and that became sort of my third or fourth book on the list of the Customs Service, Breaking with the Past, which is, again, it's just.
So that book or that project that you did, what was its impact in China? Because kind of they were the ones asking you to do this. What was the reaction? Or
the book, which was translated into Chinese and published in the mainland, did very well. So Chalai Chachi did very well, and I think my idea was twofold. One was to demonstrate that the customs service was actually Chinese and not simply an imperialist organization, although there were a lot of foreigners in it, but it was sort of an in-between institution that helped the integration of China into the emergent capitalist world economy, and that not all foreign imperialists were bastards.
So this is from like 1911 or
no, from 1850, because 1850. Because in the Taiping Rebellion, Robert Hart really sets it up, and I think there's still value for it now. Its relations are again very tense. In much of the 19th century, relations were awful between China, like the Opium Wars, after all. But this became a real institution that connected both sides, allowed them to trade through patterns that are actually the patterns of trade were quite Western, so to speak, but the way it was organized in China was the customs service really is a muyo of the Zhongli Yamen. It was under the Zhongli Yamen. So Robert Hart is a great guy, very famous, very important in European countries, but within China, he is the subordinate of a Zhongliyamen official. He has no right. He didn't have the right to write, what do you call them, Zouge, like most major officials would have. So he's a very minor official. So that allowed this thing the trade to happen. And then, 40-50% of income, both in the late Qing dynasty and throughout much of the Republican period, actually came from the customs service. Then it is so much like it ran the post office.
The income of the state.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it taxed foreign trade. Like pre-modern European states, they were dependent on taxes on trade, and the customs was like that. And then they built all these modern harbors. They built a coast guard. They gave China a navy twice. They did all the lighthouses, all the buoys, the charting, and then it became heavily involved in the bond market that raised a lot of money for China, that kept China afloat. During the Box Rebellion, Robert Hart was very instrumental in saying to the foreigners, you need to come together and negotiate as one unit with the Qing dynasty so that you don't split up China. So the breakup of China was a real issue. That he was forced to say, no, we're going to give you a major loan, but it's going to be one loan for all of you. They're very clever. And they've always paid it. I mean, nobody has defaulted on that. So, then these foreigners didn't know what to do. So, do we really want to colonize? That's a lot of work. Let's not. Instead, we just milk the taxation system, and the Russians really profited from that. So they did much too. I think the customs was other instruments in keeping China together at that point. Otherwise, it could have been partitioned like Africa. So I think to making those comments in the late 90s really was the right time to do that. And I think the reviews in China, the comments side, it won various awards. It was, top this in yearly book list and so on. Did some good at that point. Sort of one of my aims in life is to see Robert Hart's statue restored on the Bund, because the Japanese took it down, using it for making guns, no doubt. And I think he is sort of a symbol of what is possible in difficult times, and why accept the Japanese eradication of Robert Hart from the Bund. Well, one of the things we did, not me, but colleagues in London, they restored the grave of Robert Hart here, and then we invited the head of the Customs Service today, as well as some minister, I forget whom, and ambassadors and so on. And they all came, and that was actually a very nice moment. And they all were saying, yes, it would be a very good thing if Robert Hart's statue that would sort of signal an acceptance of a new world in which China has a place.
Yeah, so this would be very symbolic.
We're extremely symbolic.